Thank you for the opportunity to speak about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. I have been working at the Sonoita Creek Preserve and other places in Pima County with bosques for a number of years and enjoy the heck out of them. So my task here this morning is to talk a little bit about what these plant communities are, how they form, where they might be going, and why we should even care, I suppose, as well. So first I'd like to say, despite recent state legislation, mesquite is native. It's been it's unfortunate to have to say that, but there is evidence that it's been in southern Arizona longer than saguaros, 10,000 years. And mesquite bosques are basically woodland or forest communities that have tree-sized mesquites. Often they have a lot of hackberry trees as well, sometimes walnuts and ash. And the important thing to note about mesquite bosques, and this one is at Sonoita Creek nearby, and the Sonoita Creek Natural Area is a great place to look at mesquite bosques, is that they're on bottomland soils. So these are deep soils typically, and they have a fairly restricted distribution just kind of geologically. They have to have a landscape position that's in a broad alluvial valley, so not every channel can even have the setting for these plant communities to form. So mesquite bosques can have active flooding, or they can be isolated from modern flooding processes. And then another thing is they can be close to the water table or farther from the water table. There are bosque-type plant communities that are without a water table. It is not strictly restricted to water tables, as plant ecologists anyway. But for the most part, they are groundwater dependent ecosystems. So obviously they contain mesquite. Mesquite are known as plants that create islands of fertility, and this is a particularly important process at the lower elevations. Both shade, nutrients, as well as putting carbon into the soil. When you get into grasslands, you know, the grasses are out, putting a lot of carbon into soil too. But they really affect the nutrient cycle around them. And this is true regardless of whether they're in a bosque setting or on kind of upland settings as well. And this word is from shade and hobby. Another piece of information comes from the San Pedro River. This study looked at mesquite woodlands along the San Pedro River and the abundance of different types of animals, basically. So saltputrid, spiders, beetles, butterflies, lizards, and birds, and then abundance on the vertical axis. And the important thing to see here is that the cottonwood willow community, which has been a focus of a lot of conservation efforts in southern Arizona, mesquite is right up there with cottonwood willow in terms of the abundance of organisms. I mean, it's in a setting, these broad alluvial valleys, which are very, very productive. And so mesquite are part of that as well, that are contributing to the richness of that setting. So here's a couple of photos. This one is a vine. It's an herbaceous vine. These are plant communities are rich in herbaceous plants as well. They're important for grasslands. There's a lot of squirrel tail, saccatone mixed in with these bosques sometimes. And it's really the flooding. You can see there's a lot of flood debris mixed in here. You can see the grasses are pushed over here. This is really what contributes to the herbaceous richness. When these plant communities are more isolated from flooding, either through arroyo cutting or other processes, they tend to lose that diversity. And one of the things I just recently learned is that mesquite are really important for monarch butterflies to rest in. So these are corridors for pollinators. They are resting spots for birds and butterflies and other organizations. So historically, you probably know that we lost one of the largest mesquite bosques in North America. It was located along the Santa Cruz River. It was one of the reasons why biologists came to Tucson to look at flora and fauna was this huge, huge forest. And although we tend to concentrate on the loss of the cottonwoods along the Santa Cruz River, most of this area, and this is about 6 square miles of land here near the San Javier Mission, this is Martinez Hill, it was mesquite busking and huge trees, enormous trees. So on the right-hand side, you can see repeat photography 1942. This was already a time when the groundwater table had been drawn down, but there was still mesquite bosque there. And then in 1989, the river had pretty much widened, and the bosque was basically reduced to scrub and being cut down actively, had been cut down actively for firewood as these people at San Javier lost their livelihood. So there's a book coming out, which you will probably be interested in, called Requiem for the Santa Cruz River, and it's going to be a very interesting, beautiful book that has a lot of the science of how these plant communities transform over time. In Pima County, for the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, we did a gap analysis of plant communities in Pima County that included mesquite bosque. We had evidence for 3,000 acres of loss of mesquite bosque in our study area, which did not include the tribal lands. We have about 26,000 acres of mesquite woodland or forest in our study area in Pima County that still exist. And about 32% of that was in protected status as of 2009. And that was a fairly low percentage compared to many other riparian plant communities. So it's more often on state or private lands that are not in conservation status.
Quick question about protected status. Is that like in national parks and so on?
It's a gap status, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Right. And then, and we, I think for that we may have even included gap status 3, which a lot of times people just look at 1 and 2. So because of this lack of protection overall, relative to other plant communities, it was prioritized in the 2004 bond election, and since then, with the grace of the voters of Pima County, we have acquired 3,373 acres since 2001. And the county has a restoration goal for mesquite bosque or woodlands, and there's been about 200 acres of restoration efforts on Pima County lands. So some of the things, now I'm going to turn a little bit to the Cienega watershed in particular at Cienega Creek Natural Preserve. There's several things that have been affecting the mesquite bosques there, and you heard about one of these last year when Ryan Powell spoke about the drought, how drought is affecting. We're seeing the water table drop. We are not seeing the runoff come from the upper watershed into the lower Cienega Creek area like we used to. And we're seeing a lot of erosion and deposition in the channel and its tributaries. And this is a kind of a typical site. As you walk along the arroyo, this arroyo actually got started in the late 1800s, but it's continuing to widen in certain areas and even deepen in certain areas. There was a great study of arroyo head cut area that B. Meyer did in the preserve. But what's a little bit more difficult to see is the process of the aggradation that's occurring in some of these areas as well. And so to kind of give you a sense of that, here's a photograph. This is from a recent DWR publication on subflow, but it serves well to just illustrate some of the processes. So here you have a mesquite community that's being eroded along the outside of this bank here. So it's cutting into this bank. These trees are falling in. Here's a head cut that's going up into an area of mesquite scrubland. But the other process that's going on at the same time is that there is deposition in here. And so you see a progressively older cohort of mesquites. So the younger ones are getting established over here and then maturing over here in this sort of safe side. So that's one process that makes it difficult to understand what are the trends along these alluvial settings, these bottomlands. So one way we can look at this question of, are they going up, are they going down, is this net loss or not, is to use LIDAR. And so this is some work that Tyson Spletman did recently for us within the Cienega Preserve using LIDAR. The colors show changes in the surface elevation of the vegetation. Now, for people, we used to use LIDAR just for bare earth topography so that we can do engineering planning and so forth. And the vegetation information was thrown away, basically. This was the garbage that you didn't want. You wanted the bare earth. So Tyson is using the part that used to be thrown away to create these images.
You mean the top of the cover?
The top of the cover, yeah, the canopy cover, exactly. And you can look at the, not only the canopy cover, but using the bare earth as a reference, then you can see, is the canopy going up or down, right? So this is the change in the surface elevation of just the vegetative component. And so yellow means it's going down, blue means it's going up. So here's a stream, and you can see between 2005 and 2008, we lost a lot of vegetation height. And we think that was related mostly to the 2006 flood, which basically, if it didn't remove vegetation, it mashed things down, but it did remove quite a bit. But there was net regrowth, 2008 to 2011, and then looking over this larger period of time, you can see areas that had net increase, and then areas of decrease. And here's an aerial photograph for reference that then helps you kind of separate out, was it the channel vegetation or the Mesquite Bosque? So, this bosque is relatively stable, but it's losing some on the upper parts of the terrace. Where this stream comes in over here, we've got a lot of growth, basically, net growth. So to summarize all of that for the preserve, Tyson put together this diagram, which shows the total change, and this is in vegetation volume units. So pixels, number of pixels, using a log scale on the vertical axis here, height above the ground of the vegetation here. So in here you can see there was a gain in height in this really tall class. So really, these are mostly cottonwoods that are maturing. They're just staying in place, they're getting older and taller. But in this class right here, especially in the like 30 to 15 foot range, that's where we're losing a lot of the bosques in the preserve. We're not losing them to erosion. They're shrinking their height. They're not growing. They're declining. So that decline in that under 35 foot class, a lot of that in the bosque. At the same time, we're losing mesquite to other factors. This first picture here is the TEP transmission line. There are new industry standards that are compelling utilities to go out and use a hydro axe to grind down every plant that might create a fire hazard underneath transmission lines. And that's for 100 kilovolt or greater. So that's what's going on there. In this area, we're seeing regrowth of vegetation over time. This is a 1996 photo of an area that was cleared in 1974, I believe. Is that right? They know exactly when it cleared. It was converted to a Bermuda grass pasture, and with time, it's revegetated itself over in here. It had a little bit of help from some of the people in this room over in here, but a lot of regrowth is going to happen. So this will probably come back into a bosque with time. One of the interesting things that you wouldn't notice from that is over here. This looks like a mesquite bosque. Every tree was cut down to about yay high for wood at one time. Wood cutting was a very important rangeland product. And there was also some other phreatophyte control efforts in the Emprida Ranch that resulted in the loss of mesquite bosque historically. This diagram comes from this work that Ron Tiller, who's here, and Gita and others did for the Saccatone grasslands. It's a state and transition model.
Actually, Julia, this one is the state transition model from NRCS, so
it really is, yeah. But it's in your you put together the photographs that kind of illustrate the concepts of a state transition model for how these different communities cycle among themselves. So this is a very good one. I made some modifications from my own I guess observations that I would say, but in general, these kinds of state and transition models can help us understand what might be the trajectory of a plant community in a particular precipitation zone, and this is for the 12 to 16 inch precipitation zone over time. And so last year we were hearing about climate scenarios, climate change scenarios. So what would be the trajectory really for mesquite bosques over time? Can be informed by a diagram like that. So as we heard last year, we might have warm, wet conditions, we might have warm, dry conditions. We can probably expect both over time. If we have warm, wet conditions, these are the conditions that might favor expansion and certainly maturation of some of the young mesquite bosques that we have, but also potentially expansion of mesquite bosques into saxatone grasslands, which are a rare plant community themselves. If we have warm, dry conditions, we can probably expect a lot more arroyo cutting and loss, movement of sediment, instability in channels. We might see a lot of erosion, but also the loss of the water table for some of these mesquite bosques that had depended on them will be a factor, and we may see net decline, particularly at the lower elevations where we already have bosques that are isolated on top of these historic arroyos. So those may go, but keep in mind that there will be this formation of new bosques within the arroyo where it's still well watered by floodwaters. But the wild card here is really what is the anthropogenic water table decline that's going to be superimposed on top of any kind of climate change effects. What is the phreatophyte control? Will we see a resurgence of phreatophyte control as we get more concerned about water supplies? It's a real issue. Whatever the case will be, we can be confident that the trajectories of these plant communities will not only reflect climate, but also what our cultural values are as well. Thank you.